6 years except been asleep from your life, but you don't bethink a distinct second of that time. You don't apperceive breath you were, what was done to you, or why you were larboard alone. This is not aloof a story about disappearance. It is a story about a acknowledgement that aloft alike more questions than the dematerialization itself. 5 bodies entered the jungles of Cambodia. 6 years later, one of them emerged to assimilate the road. An alone vessel, a man with no name and no past. What happened to him and the fate of the other 4 is abstruseness that makes the blood run cold. And the best terrifying thing about this chance is the silence. The blackout of the boskage and the silence of the sole survivor. It all began in 2017. 5 adolescent people, volunteers, and amateur campaign came calm with one goal, to acquisition an absent Khmer temple in the impenetrable jungles of Ratanakiri province in northeastern Cambodia. This abode is one of the wildest and least explored on the planet. Dense forests, swamps, no roads, and complete isolation from civilization. For them, it was a challenge, the chance of a lifetime. The accumulation was led by Liam, a former soldier in his mid-30s. He was an experienced adventurer and was responsible for acumen and safety. With him was Chloe, a medic by training, a babe who had anticipation through the Aboriginal aid kit down to the Aboriginal detail. From snake venom to close agitation remedies, Ben was the architect of the group. He had all the gadgets, GPS trackers, satellite phones, cameras, drones. Maya was a historian, and she was the one who came up with the abstraction of this nameless temple, which was alone known through legends amid the bounded tribes. And the 5th was Ethan. He was a documentary filmmaker, and his job was to film the absolute journey. It was through his eyes that we were declared to see their triumph. They able for almost a year. They advised maps, bought the best equipment, and consulted with experts. They had everything. Water filters, 3 weeks account of food, signal flares, and accessory buzz with several sets of batteries. They weren't naive tourists. They were a well-prepared expedition. The plan was simple. Get to the aftermost apple in a rented SUV, and from there airing about 60 kilometers through the jungle, abyssal with old French maps and accessory images. The estimated biking time was about a week anniversary way. They promised to analysis in every 2 days. The Aboriginal 3 canicule went according to plan. They beatific several short messages. Everything's fine. We're on schedule. The boskage is something else. They absorbed a brace of photos, smiling, bathed faces adjoin a green wall of accoutrement and trees. The last message from Ben was accustomed on the 3rd day. The arresting is accepting very weak. We're entering a below area. Next advice a fare back we reach higher arena in 2 or 3 days. Don't accord up. That was the aftermost anyone heard from them. 3 canicule passed, then 4. A week. Families began to sound the alarm. At first they approved to calm them down. The boskage, poor communication. Surely they aloof couldn't find a signal. But aback the additional week passed, it became a blaze that something was wrong. A chase operation began. The Cambodian authorities deployed the aggressive who were abutting by volunteers from the missing men's home countries. But Ratanakiri is a blooming hell. From above, from a helicopter, annihilation can be apparent except a continuous carpeting of treetops several dozen meters high. Combing through the jungle on basal was like attractive for a needle in a haystack, the measurement of a small European country. Every footfall was a struggle, and they had to cut their way through with machetes. The calefaction and humidity were 100%, and there were mosquitoes and snakes. 12 canicule afterwards the chase began. One of the groups stumbled aloft their last camp. It was amid about 20 kilometers from the point breadth the aftermost bulletin was sent. The analysis was both hopeful and terrifying. The tents were still standing, neatly arranged. Adjacent was a cold campfire. Scattered dishes lay on the ground. Several metal bowls and mugs. Sleeping accoutrements were central the tents, but they were empty. Personal belongings were still there. Clothes, books, hygiene items. It looked as if the bodies had artlessly gotten up and left, planning to acknowledgement in 5 minutes. But that wasn't the strangest thing. The strangest affair was what wasn't there. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood. There were no signs of an attack by agrarian animals. No burst pieces of fabric. No barbed marks. All the most valuable and basic items for survival. Backpacks, accessory phones, GPS navigators, weapons, Aboriginal aid kit, and about all of their food supplies were gone. They disappeared along with the Bristles people. Investigators and rescuers were at a dead end. Assorted theories were put forward. The Aboriginal and best accessible was that they had gotten lost. But Liam was too accomplished to accomplish such a mistake. Besides, they would not accept abandon the affected with all their equipment. The second was an attack. But by whom? There were no blackmailer groups in these jungles. The bounded tribes that were occasionally encountered in these parts were peaceful and alone strangers. An attack by poachers or smugglers perhaps, but they would accept larbird traces. And why would they booty bristles foreigners captive? That would account too abundant trouble. Animals. A ample predator such as a tiger or bobcat would accept larbird, a completely altered picture. The search continued for addition month. Helicopters circled over the jungle. Rescuers combed dozens of aboveboard kilom to no avail. The 5 men seemed to accept vanished into thin air. In the end, the animate search was alleged off. The case was officially declared an accident. The Bristles explorers were declared missing and over time presumed dead. Their families mourned their admired ones and the apples slowly forgot about the story. The jungles of rotten Akiri kept their secret. A year passed, a fresh 2, a fresh 5. It seemed that this chance would abide an unsolved mystery. And afresh in 2023, 6 years later, the absurd happened. On an active artery a few dozen kilometers from Phnom Penh, the basic of Cambodia, the badge best up a aberrant man. He was walking barefoot, alternating the ancillary of the road, dressed in rags that had once been clothes. He was emaciated. Bark and bones covered in adobe and old long-healed scars. His face was overgrown with a blubbery beard, his bristles disordered into a distinct mass. He did not acknowledge to people. His boring was alone and detached. He could not say a word, not a single sound. He aloof stared silently at one spot. Of course he had no abstracts on him. The badge took him to the nearest hospital. Cerebration, he was aloof, another homeless actuality or mentally ill. He was placed in a breath and began analysis for exhaustion and dehydration. No one knew who he was or breath he came from. He was just a nameless patient. Addition, tragic fate on the streets of a big city. But one of the doctors, an adolescent intern who was absorbed by baffling cases, happened to see a photo of the man in a police report. Something in his features, alike beneath the band of dirt and bristles, seemed vaguely accustomed to him. He began digging through the archives, attractive through cases of missing bodies from the aftermost 10 years, and he began it. It was a photo of Ethan, an adolescent animated documentary filmmaker from a campaign in 2017. The affinity was striking. To confirm his hunch, a DNA analysis was needed. Samples were beatific to an international database. The acknowledgement came back a few weeks afterwards and abashed everyone. It was a 100% match. The bashful and burst man begin on the highway was Ethan, one of the 5 travelers who abolished in the jungles of rotten Akiri 6 years ago. He was back, but his acknowledgement brought no answers. It alone brought new, alike added horror. Where had he been all these years? What had happened to the others? And why is he silent? A medical examination provided the aboriginal alarming clues. His anatomy was a map of his suffering. Multiple old scars covered his back, arms and legs. Doctors angled that the scars had been larbored by an edgeless but hard object, possibly a stick or a whip made of vines. Some of the wounds were very old, others about recent. Characteristic ring-shaped scars were found on his ankles and wrists, as if he had been kept in shackles or angry with ropes for a continued time. His joints, especially his knees and ankles, were worn bottomward to an accompaniment archetypal of actual old people. This appropriate that he had either absolved a lot and for a continued time over asperous breath or had been affected to perform some affectionate of back-breaking physical labor. Tests showed no traces of modern food, drugs, or toxins in his body. His diet had consisted of plant-based foods and possibly raw meat for a continued time. He had not brushed his teeth in 6 years. There were no traces of soap, shampoo, or any added chemicals on his bark or in his hair. He was absolutely cut off from civilization. But the best frightening thing was his brainy state. He was diagnosed with astringent dissociative amnesia. He didn't aloof not remember what had happened to him. He didn't remember who he was. He didn't recognize himself in the mirror. He didn't respond to his name. He didn't accept speech in any language. All attempts by psychologists to authorize acquaintance with him failed. He sat on the bed in his ward, agitation back and forth, and remained silent. His boring was completely empty. Sometimes at night, the nurses heard him authoritative aberrant glottal sounds that articulate added like the clicks or cries of some nightbird than human speech. Aback he was apparent photographs of his ancestors and a company from the missing expedition. He looked at them without expression, as if seeing them for the first time. He was an active ghost, a shell of a man, bare of his personality and memory. The investigation was resumed with renewed vigor. Ethan was their alone lead, their only witness, but he was mute. So, the investigators began to abstraction not his words, but his anatomy and behavior, trying to account of what might accept happened in the Boscage 6 years ago. The board and doctors were faced with an aberrant task. They had the alone active attestant who had seen everything, but his apperception was locked behind 7 locks. Ethan became the subject of round-the-clock surveillance. Every gesture, every glance, every sound was analyzed in the achievement of a ward a key to the mystery. His behavior in the hospital breath was that of an agrarian animal caught in a cage. He was abashed of enclosed spaces, but he was alike more frightened by the accessible sky he could see from the window. He didn't Betty by at night, but dozed anyhow for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, sitting in a corner and alert to every sound. Any sudden noise, an aperture creaking, an object falling fabricated him cringe. At the same time he was absolutely above to the sounds of civilization. The hum of cars al fresco, the window, sirens, and the television were aloof accomplishments babbled to him. His attitude against aliment was peculiar. At first he banned to eat the hospital food. But aback the nurse left the tray and alternate a few minutes later, she began that all the aliment had disappeared. Later, through surveillance cameras, they saw him feverishly attractive around and advance aliment into his mouth, hiding what he couldn't eat beneath the mattress, behind the radiator, and in the bedside table drawer. It was the aptitude of a man who had been craving for a long time, and did not apperceive aback he would be able to eat again. The psychologist who tried to assignment with him bound accomplished a dead end. Talk analysis was useless. They moved on to added methods including art therapy and music. They gave him paper, pencils, and clay. For several weeks he ignored these items. One day he picked up an allotment of charcoal that had been used for cartoon and began to draw with it on a breadth of paper. At first they were aloof anarchic lines, scribbles. But gradually, day afterwards day, a pattern began to arise from these lines. He drew the aforementioned affair over and over again. It was not a cartoon in the accepted sense. It was a map, primitive, childish, but definitely a map. It depicted a river that breached in two, a abundance with a distinctive angled aiguille and a cluster of dots that resembled an accumulation of trees or rocks. In the centermost of the map he always drew a cross. The investigators took this actual seriously. They pulled up all the accessory images of the province of Rotten Airy. It was a titanic task matching an Asper's child's cartoon with thousands of above-board kilometers of real terrain. Analysts spent several weeks working with the maps, superimposing Ethan's drawing on altered areas of the jungle. And they begin it. They begin a match in one of the best alien and inaccessible areas which the first search affair had not reached. The terrain absolutely akin Ethan's drawing. There was the aforementioned river with a fork, the aforementioned abundance with a recognizable chip. This breadth was an alone valley surrounded by about arduous cliffs. It could alone be accomplished by against down the bluff or through a distinct narrow crevice blousy with rocks and overgrown with vines. During the aboriginal chase operation, this area had been apparent as anesthetic and bypassed. Now they had a specific goal. But what did the cantankerous in the centermost of the map mean? The abode breadth he had been captivated bound or the abode breadth his friends were buried? Another accumulation of experts was animate in parallel. Linguists and anthropologists recorded the aberrant glottal sounds Ethan fabricated at night. They analyzed dozens of hours of recordings and concluded that these were not meaningless sounds. There was a specific structure, repetition, and accent to them. It was some anatomy of communication but not beastly language. The experts suggested that it was either an imitation of beastly sounds that he used to acquaint with addition or a primitive accent that he had been taught. They began arena him recordings of assorted accustomed sounds. The reactions were striking. The sound of rain or wind calmed him, but the sounds of some animals acquired him to panic. He reacted decidedly strongly to the cry of a attenuate hornbill bird that lives alone in the highlands of Cambodia. Upon audition this recording, Ethan cowered in a corner, covered his head with his hands, and began to bedrock back and forth, authoritative a quiet whimpering sound. It was 18-karat beastly terror. An ethnobotanist was alleged in to investigate the issue. He carefully examined the rags Ethan was cutting as well as samples taken from his bristles and under his fingernails. Under a microscope, he apparent spores of an attenuate breed of bracken and pollen from an annual that alone grows under specific distance on limestone cliffs at an distance of added than 500 m above sea level. And that was addition perfect match. Both the horned bird and this fern were begin in the actual isolated valley adumbrated on Ethan's map. Now, the analysis had 3 independent pieces of affirmation that led to the same conclusion. A map fatigued from the depths of the subconscious, a agitation acknowledgement to the cry of a bird built into a specific region, and diminutive bulb particles that could alone except gotten on his clothes there. There was no doubt everything that happened to Ethan and his company happened in this valley. It was absolutely to adapt a new expedition. This time it was not our accomplishment mission, but rather a badge operation. The group included Cambodian Appropriate Forces soldiers, an investigator, a doctor, and an advisor from a bounded association who knew the area bigger than anyone else. Their task was not aloof to acquisition traces of the missing, but to be able to encounter anyone or anything. No one knew what accessible them in this valley. Were the added associates of the group still alive? So, what condition were they in? If they had been taken captive, who were their captors? An isolated association that had never had contact with civilization? Criminals who had set up an abject in the mountains or something abroad that defied rational explanation? There were added questions than answers. Itana was additionally actually able for the expedition, but not as a participant, but as a detector. The investigators decided that his attendance nearby, even in the assurance of the abject camp, might trigger new memories or reactions that would advise on sight. His condition stabilized somewhat. He began to eat from his bowl and chock-full ambuscade food. He still did not allege or appearance any signs of recognition, but he became calmer. However, aback he was apparent a map of the area breadth the accumulation was activity and the valley was a secular out to him, his behavior afflicted dramatically. He began to breathe heavily, his eyes abounding with terror. He confused abroad from the table, jumped up, and began banging his head against the wall, authoritative that same guttural beat sound. The doctors had to accord him an able sedative. It was the arch acknowledgement he had had during his absolute break in the hospital. He didn't remember, but his body, his instincts, remembered everything. They remembered the abhorrence that accessible them in that valley. A few canicule later, the group flew by helicopter to the basal of the Abundance Ambit Aboriginal in the morning. The cartage could go no further. They had several canicule of arduous walking ahead of them to ability the actual crevice that was the alone access to the valley. The acclimate was deteriorating, and abundant clouds were acquisition in the sky. The boskage greeted them with a wall of humid, airless air and a deafening chorus of airy creatures. Every appropriate armament soldier was armed and accessible for battle. They absolved in complete silence, communicating only with gestures. They did not apperceive what they would acquisition there above the rocks. However, they knew for assertive that they were entering an area breadth the laws of acculturation did not apply. A place from which no one had alternate 6 years ago. About no one. Their ambition was a cross on a map fatigued by a man who had lost his name. And they were determined to get to the basal of the truth, no matter how abhorrent it ability be. The expedition entered the gorge and the world changed. The oral babble of the boskage to which they had become accustomed over the accomplished few days subsided. Actuality in the basin there was an about complete back-breaking silence broken alone by the alive of the wind in the crowns of alien copse and the abroad complete of water. The air was still and heavy. The bounded advisor who had been walking confidently afore now looked about constantly, his face expressing awesome fear. He told the accumulation baton that the elders of his tribe had consistently banned them to enter this valley, calling it the abode where the alcohol are silent. The accumulation moved forward boring and cautiously, keeping their weapons at the ready. Soon they came to the river, the actual one with the fork in Ethan's drawing. The baptize was dark and stagnant. Following the riverbed, they began to apprehend strange signs. There were notches in the tree trunks that did not attending like hunters' marks. Between the copse were accessories made of accoutrement and acicular bamboo stakes, primitive but deadly. It was a blaze that someone lived or had lived here, someone who did not appetite alien guests. After several hours of walking they came out into a clearing. What they saw made them freeze. In the average of the allowance stood several battered huts congenital of branches, clay and approach leaves. In the center was a long, algid blaze pit. The settlement looked abandoned. The Special Forces Administrator gave the signal, and the fighters advance out, Alpha to examine the buildings. In one of the huts, they begin the aboriginal allotment of irrefutable evidence. Leaning against the bank was the lid of an artificial food container, absolutely the aforementioned as those used by the missing expedition. In addition our allotment of a blaze blue nylon bolt from a haversack had been used as an application on an adulterated roof. A metal spoon lay nearby, angled and blackened. These were Ethan's group's belongings. They had been here, but breadth were the people themselves? Afterwards analytic all the huts, they begin no bodies or any other traces. Afresh the investigator looked afresh at the map Ethan had drawn across. It was not fatigued at the afterimage of the settlement, but hardly to the ancillary at the basal of a cliff. The accumulation headed there and they begin the place. There were 4 baby mounds laid out in a circle with river stones for graves. After giving the adjustment to exhume the bodies, the investigator acquainted a chill rise in his throat. They formed in silence. In the aboriginal grave, not very deep, they begin beastly remains. Next to the basic lay a compass, an old brass compass on a covering strap, which Liam, the accumulation leader, consistently agitated with him. In the additional grave, they found remains and a baby argent brand in the appearance of a bow-shaped moon. A gift from Maya's ancestor afore she left. The 3rd and 4th graves additionally contained personal accoutrements that accustomed them to identify Chloe and Ben, afterwards a doubt. All 4 were here. Their continued journey had concluded in this nameless valley. The forensic Abel, who was allotment of the team, conducted a basic assay of the remains. He began no signs of violent afterlife in the accepted sense. No bullet holes or fractures from blows. But the action of the basic told a different story. Abhorrent apathetic death. Extreme exhaustion. Signs of abject and other diseases acquired by vitamin deficiency. They weren't killed. They died a apathetic aching afterlife over several years. But who acted them? And what happened to Ethan? Why did he survive? At that moment, the guide, who had been standing abreast all this time, alleged the commander over. The acicular to the rock. On the bland apparent of the stone, just above beastly height, there were faint scratches. They led to the side, to the thick bracken at the actual basal of the mountain. They did not arise to be natural cracks. They were signs larboard by humans. Following them, the accumulation apparent a narrow access to a cavern almost invisible abaft a blind of vines. The darkness was clammy and smelled of old smoky air. The appropriate armament soldiers turned on the flashlights on their weapons and entered the building. The cave was dank but acutely inhabited. In the bend lay a accumulation of old skins and dry leaves, a bed. The walls were scratched with the aforementioned aberrant symbols as those on the copse outside. And in the farthest, darkest bend of the cave sat he, a man, an earlier man, whizzed with long gray bristles and a beard, dressed in animal skins. He sat crouched, his arms wrapped about his knees, and stared at the ablaze of the lanterns, afterwards fear, but with an affectionate of beastly curiosity. When one of the fighters shouted a command at him in Khmer, he did not respond. The aloof stared. And afresh he made a sound, a soft, glottal click, exactly like the one Ethan had fabricated in the hospital ward. Aggregate fell into place. This earlier man was not a member of some agrarian tribe. Judging by his features, he was of Kham descent. Perhaps he was a above soldier from the Sime Rouge era who had fled to the jungle decades ago to escape amends and had lost his apperception over the years, turning into a savage. He was the sole adept of this valley. And afresh one day 5 strangers invaded his world. Ethan's group had apparently gotten lost. Their equipment had burst down, and they had stumbled aloft this valley, exhausted. They were too anemic to action back. And the earlier man, he wasn't an assassin in the accurate sense of the word. He was a dement who had lived in complete confinement for 30 or 40 years. For him, these bristles were not victims, but rather a company, his own little tribe. He didn't apperceive how to treat people. He kept them with him like animals. He fed them what he ate himself, roots, raw meat, larvae. He taught them his accent of clicks and bird cries. He punished them for disobedience as one punishes a disobedient dog. Hence the scars on Ethan's body. 4 of them could not endure such a life. Their bodies, accustomed to civilization, could not cope with ache and the monstrous diet. They died one afterwards another, and the earlier man acted them as best he could. Ethan survived artlessly because he was the youngest and physically strongest. He spent 6 years in this hell. He apprenticed how to be beastly and learned to be an animal active in a cave. His escape was best acceptable an accident. Conceivably the earlier man fell ill and grew weak, or possibly Ethan, following some instinct, larboarded the valley and absolved until, by arduous luck, he came upon a road. The earlier man was led out of the cave. He did not resist. He was taken to Phnom Penh. It was absurd to put him on trial. He was declared insane, a man whose apperception had been destroyed by decades of absolute isolation. He was placed in a closed psychiatric hospital. The case of the expedition's dematerialization was officially closed. The charcoal of the 4 travelers were alternate to their families. And Ethan never spoke again. His anamnesis never returned. He spent the blow of his canicule in a specialized nursing home. He was calm and obedient, but his eyes always remained empty. Sometimes sitting by the window and attractive at the trees, he would accomplish quiet glottal clicks. He was home safe amid people. But allotment of his body remained there in the valley where the alcohol are silent. In a place that asleep his name and his past, leaving a baffed alone a active carapace full of quiet horror.